Nastavljamo sa programom, dragi posetioci i dragi gledalci. Regulisanje upravljanja veštačkom inteligencijom i prepoznavanjem emocija je tema koja do sada nije načinjena na domaćim konferencijama i u medijskom prostoru. O njoj govori Andrew McStay, Professor of Digital Life at the University of Bangor, United Kingdom. Let's see the video. Let's try again. What do we have, Professor McStay?
Hi.
Hi. Oh, we can hear you now. Can you?
Oh, success. They're very good.
Great. Okay, so fire at will. You have next 30 minutes. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the warm introduction. And hello to the room, and apologies for sound technicalities there. So this talk is about emotion. It's about human emotion, and it's about the use of technologies to profile human emotion. So it's a slightly strange premise, particularly if you're unfamiliar with the topic. But yeah, I think as we get into the talk, you'll begin to see why this is an important topic for anybody working in the technology area. So the structure of the talk is to talk you through some of the technologies, some of the practices, and some of the psychological suppositions that underpin the human profiling of emotion, but then to move on to talk about some of the kind of the real life use case, both from kind of large companies in terms of the Microsofts and the Amazons of this world, but also the startups that are seeking to develop new business opportunities from the profiling of human emotion. But of course, this session is about ethics. And so one of the key things that I really like to do is talk about through some of the risk issues, some of the harms, and some of the kind of the value-based problems with the use of these technologies, and then begin to talk a little bit about the kind of changing role of governance and the changing role of law in relation to emotion profiling. As we'll get on to 2021 and 2022, it's been a lively time for those interested in the question of human profiling of emotion. And if time allows, I'll get on and kind of share a little some survey data about kind of citizen perspectives, but I suspect we might run a little short of time there. But yeah, let's get into it. So in terms of what emotion recognition is, it basically involves this. It involves computational means. So that involves things such as kind of skin-worn sensors. It involves computer vision. It involves voice modalities. But the broad idea is to kind of feel into or even empathize with psychophysiological states. So it includes emotion recognition, but within that question of emotion, it's more broadly that kind of sense of kind of human subjectivity in terms of moods, affects, but also things such as sleepiness, fatigue, attention, and intention. So possibly already when we start thinking about tiredness, we start thinking about attention. We could start thinking about cars and driving, for example. We can start to think about uses in the classroom and schoolroom, and even technologies that are interested in testing for sincerity and even lies, which, is clearly quite questionable. So in terms of the basic gist, just to give some concrete background, basically the idea, emotion is expressed a range of ways. It will be expressed through faces, we express through voices. We also do it in relation to kind of eye tracking, where eye happens to be on the screen, but of course also gesture, behavior, but also as well, our bodies say a huge amount. So in addition to kind of the behavior and movement of the body, in terms of the uses of sensors to kind of check, to detect and kind of profile such as things as sweat, which, while possibly a little bit gross, it does kind of indicate changes in kind of electrical circuit currents, I should say, on the body, which thereafter, particularly kind of in negative emotions such as anxiety, such as stress, can say a lot. Muscle tension, heart rate rhythm, temperature, and so on. Again, real indicators of emotion. So in addition to kind of facial expressions from camera feeds and videos and video files, in addition to voice through kind of voice assistants that measures kind of speech and the speed of speech and the slowness of speech, there are a range of kind of different ways of kind of gauging emotion. And I kind of also tagged on to the end here as well, increasing interest in kind of VR-based applications, but of course also metaverse-based applications. And Yep, there's a lot of hype around the metaverse, but I think, as we'll get onto in a moment, the overlap with emotion profile is actually quite significant. Yeah, we'll get into that as we go. So I think one of the reasons why I've got this picture up on the screen is I think it says a lot. So it's from the affective computing group. Affective computing being the area of computer science that's interested in profiling emotions. And this is just a tweet. It's not a PhD thesis, but I think it says a lot. I think it's significant in terms of the idea, the supposition that emotions are found inside of a person, that they can be mined, that they can be computationally rendered, and they can be put to work. I think this, it really speaks to oversimplistic accounts of what emotion is, because when we think about what emotion is in terms of our daily life outside the conference room and outside of web calls, emotion is a much more fluid idea. It's not just kind of a basic set of categories of emotion: happiness, sadness, anger, disgust, and so on, but rather emotion is something that emerges out of context. So I think we need to be skeptical. I think what emotion is not at all transparent. And I think that puts kind of the reality of what emotion is, the ambiguity, the inherent ambiguity about the nature of emotion, and the affective computing and emotional AI industry. I think it puts them slightly at odds. So we need to be a little bit skeptical. And the academic field itself, and I won't go into full lecture mode here, but the academic field in terms of understanding emotion is massively divided. So some areas will think about kind of the idea of kind of pre-programmed emotions in the brain that are enacted when we kind of when we meet a certain stimuli, be that another person, be it something that happens in conversation, or be it an object or a tweet that we encounter, whatever it might be. And others kind of see emotions as something actually kind of much more decisional, something that informs our judgment. So there are kind of really kind of wide and often contradictory definitions of what emotion are. Broadly sitting along one hand, on the left-hand side, the biological, pre-programmed, and then the other side, you kind of have the more kind of social, which will admit of kind of basic physiological states, but as to what emotions are, they're far more social than biological accounts would usually suppose. So in terms of using technologies to gauge and understand emotion, that comes with certain risks. It comes with certain social risks. So on the left-hand side there, I've just kind of flagged some of the kind of key issues and some of the key problems with the idea of using technologies to try to gauge and infer emotion. And perhaps, at the top is the kind of question of privacy, the question of privacy. So there's two parts to that. One, in terms of physical, in terms of kind of tracking bodies and using biometrics to do that. But also there's a mental dimension to this. And this is perhaps something a little bit more novel in relation to the question of emotion, that interest in feeling in subjective states of human life. But then there's also implications for questions of freedom of thought. Because if we start from the supposition that thought, cognition, rationality, that doesn't just sit alone, it's deeply influenced by emotion. So certainly kind of those with a marketing background on the panel will be very aware of the relationship between emotion and cognition. So yeah, there's a real connection between the two there, and scope to impact on freedom of thought. And of course, the technologies are certainly fallible. They're very problematic, particularly as they stand at the moment. So given that the likely uses of these technologies, which is broadly in any situation or any scope where it's useful to know something about emotion, that has implications for kind of security, for insurance, use in schools. So making judgments about people, poor judgments about people, it can be very problematic to say the least. So there's kind of a list here. I won't go through them all, but I think these issues of kind of both mental and physical privacy are particularly important. But I'll jump on and perhaps come back to these if time allows. I think, the use of kind of technologies in this way, you might think, well, who would be doing this? Who would be kind of making judgments about emotion, about character, about personality, about disposition on the basis of technology? But there's a real market for this stuff. So faceception is perhaps kind of one of the most egregious uses. I'll come on to some of the kind of the more pro-social, the better uses in time. But I think this slide kind of really signifies some of the problems in terms of to use facial images to infer not just emotion, but personality too. So faceception is an Israel-based company, very much kind of oriented around security. So basically the idea is that you can assess human dispositions, such as whether a person is a terrorist or worse, from a facial expression and from a face arrangement. This might kind of seem strange, odd, bizarre, but they've been in business for a while. They've been in business since their kind of mid 2010s. So yeah, with a lot of clients. So it's a thing. And then there's Spotify, perhaps an application that more of us will be familiar with. So certainly marketers in the room and on the call will be aware that advertising has Spotify has a long-standing relationship with WPP, one of the big advertising conglomerates. But the next step for Spotify is to use biometrics. So part of that, if you look on the kind of left-hand side of the screen, you will see speech recognition, but move into the middle. It's also about kind of pulling data from voice, about emotional state and gender, age and accents and so forth. But the idea here is to improve some of the accuracy of these technologies in terms of kind of where the emotion is taking place, is to understand that in relation to where a person is, such as the physical environment or where they happen to be, whether they're having a coffee, whether they're on the train, and so on. But also social environment in terms of who a person is with, where they happen to be, either at a party or a rave. So the idea is to begin to triangulate and to put in context where the emotion is kind of said to be happening, which lends greater confidence as to whether kind of an emotion can be detected or gauged or not. So yes, I mentioned metaverse. Yep, there's been a lot of hype around it, certainly kind of from kind of Meta and Facebook. But for me, I think, one of the more interesting companies in this area is Microsoft. They've been kind of working in this area for some time, certainly kind of in their kind of VR-based applications. And one of the things that they're really interested in doing is kind of having emotion profiling parts, adding those to Microsoft Teams, but in a kind of a metaverse-based context. So the idea is that we'll kind of have our laptop screens in front of us and we can enter an immersive space, or we could be using kind of full VR goggles. But I think that halfway house of using laptop screens to gauge facial expressions and render them in world on the avatars, that starts to kind of move us to something a little bit more realistic. So I don't think we're all going to be jumping on web calls with face masks anytime soon, but Microsoft is certainly kind of moving in that direction, that halfway house of using kind of facial coding to gauge expressions of face by the muscles moving around and to render that into kind of in-world avatars. It's an interesting idea, and we could even see how that could be an interesting application just in terms of this conference and the mixed reality way that we're engaging with this talk and conference. So yeah, so Microsoft is particularly interested in that regard. One of the other main use cases for emotion profiling has been in the recruitment sector. So HighView is it's a US-based company. And basically the idea is that before any human interview would take place, a person will record their video and they will submit that to HighView. And then using kind of facial coding analytics and potentially voice-based analytics to make kind of judgments about the kind of profile, about kind of a person's profile and their behavior in kind of for an interview-based context. And that's interesting because it's not just kind of the facial analytics and the voice analytics that's of interest here. it's the automated part of all of this. So certainly, and potentially for kind of those in the room, for executive-based jobs, this is unlikely to be a thing. Although it may be for kind of pre-screening stages. But for kind of more kind of everyday, for more run-of-the-mill jobs, certainly this is of kind of keen interest to kind of companies such as the Hilton Group and companies that kind of who are large recruiters. But of course, the automation key is part in terms of reducing costs involved with the onboarding process. So the automation of recruitment and emotion profiling therein to judge kind of behavior and performance, again, is certainly a thing. I think, in terms of Alexa's interest in this, they've been interested in this space for a while. But I think anybody who has a home voice assistant, you will know they don't always work. They can be frustrating and they can be a little annoying. So I think if we add emotion profiling to the mix, there's kind of a real problem of high error rates by an emotion-enabled voice assistant. But I think it will come. I think it will come in time. And I think part of that is going to be building out the capacity in a much more localized fashion. The way the technologies kind of currently work, they're very universal. And of course, when we say universal, we kind of in many ways kind of mean US based. Where I'm from, in Wales, many people speak Welsh. And of course, in Serbia, people speak Serbian. So there's issues and problems, both not just in relation to what people say, i.e. language, but also how people emote as well. So that kind of regional need for variation is something that Amazon will struggle with for a while, but I think we'll get there. And I think the voice-based analytics is particularly interesting because the use of emotion in relation to technology does have kind of promising dimensions. And I think that is about kind of naturalizing interaction with technology. So, although kind of this talk is kind of quite critical, I do kind of see positive aspects, particularly in relation to more natural relationships with technology. Cars are another big one. So cars are particularly interesting because emotion profiling and fatigue profiling, affect profiling, there's a lot of policy backing, both in Europe, or particularly in Europe, beyond, but particularly in Europe. So there are a number of initiatives. First is kind of the Vision Zero initiative. Basically, the idea is kind of reduce death to zero, to kind of stop all deaths on the road. And a key way of doing that is not just have cameras that point outwards, to help the driver, but also cameras that point inwards, again to detect whether kind of a driver is distracted, turning away, whether they're attending to kind of things that are going in front of them, but also possibly whether their kind of eyes are looking a bit sleepy, whether a driver is looking fatigued. So the use of in-cabin and in-car profiling is something we're going to see a lot more of. So there's two parts to that. One is kind of EU policy in this area, but the second part is Euro NCAP. So anybody who has any experience with the car market, you'll be aware that Euro NCAP is one of kind of the big safety standards organizations. And it's good for car makers to have positive accolades and awards from a Euro NCAP because it kind of helps with the marketing of their cars. So certainly cars is one of the more sensible one of the more, the closer to reality applications of these technologies. But of course, then there's children. At the Emotional AI Lab where I work in the UK, we've done a lot of work with children and with parents as well. So basically the idea here is to use sensors to track the well-being of children. So there's two ways to look at that. One, so some in the room might be thinking, that's horrible, that's horrific. Others might be thinking, well, actually, if I can kind of protect and kind of care for my child's well-being in ways that are hopefully respectful of privacy, then maybe it's not such a bad thing. And certainly that's what we find when, in terms of the work that we've done with parents and focus groups and UK survey work, we find real ambivalence. Ambivalence meaning that, being pulled in two directions. That yes, kind of privacy concerns are a real pull, but on the other hand, if technology can help with parenting, then there's some interest. So I think one of the key areas to keep an eye on when it comes to emotional recognition is use in relation to children. Another is education. So China is long familiar with the use of cameras in classrooms to gauge both emotion. So as you kind of see the girl on the right-hand side, she has a neutral expression there, but possibly slightly happy, possibly a kind of slightly cheeky smile there. But also as well in the classroom itself, as you see on the left-hand side, the cameras will gauge for attention and distraction as well. This raises all sorts of questions in terms of certainly in terms of freedom of thought, but more basic kind of fundamental questions. Is that something we would have wanted ourselves as children? And of course, is it something we want for our own children? Again, parents in China, again, are quite ambivalent. China has a very competitive school system. So parents are often kind of unwilling to kind of challenge the use of kind of technologies both in the classroom and outside of the classroom due to its hyper-competitive system. But certainly there are kind of privacy concerns as well. In the West and beyond, outside of China, so companies, Microsoft are particularly keen in the EdTech area, Intel are particularly keen on the EdTech area, and there's a lot of international policy backing for the use of these types of technologies. So the OECD, for example, again, really kind of pushing the use of technology in classrooms to help with kind of social and emotional learning. My point of view, questionable, but it's certainly a lot of backing for it. Retail, another key area as well. So I think you probably find it'd be interesting if there anybody, particularly if possibly any students learning, it would make an excellent dissertation idea to see whether which kind of retail outlets in Serbia are using kind of in-camera profiling of emotion. We did a freedom of access request in the UK, basically where we were able to ask kind of multiple retailers whether they're using this. We was really surprised about how many retailers are overlapping their current CCTV offerings with emotion profiling itself. So, and the idea is kind of fairly straightforward in terms of looking at how the person is interacting with each other and what their experiences of different kind of spaces and places are within the store. So in terms of being able to build kind of emotion heat maps within the geography of a store, that's a keen interest to anybody who's kind of looking to manage retail estate and think about where they want to position products and offerings and so on. Advertising, another key area. The use of facial coding and emotion profiling in cameras in the UK is fairly well established now. So leading vendors such as Ocean Outdoor, which is one of our big UK outdoor advertisers, generally now kind of have cameras kind of watching for reactivity. So whereas a few years ago, this was kind of a one-off kind of test, increasingly it's a standardized offer. Again, I'd be really interested to know how things are in Serbia, maybe something we can get into later. And then there's social media. So the use of kind of social media, the use of kind of political advertising in social media, again, that's very much based on emotion. So whereas kind of so far, I've talked primarily about biometrics, about faces, about what we say, about skin, and about bodies. Of course, there's a lot of emotion online. So the idea of using emotion recognition systems and emotional AI systems to understand the emotionality of online speech, be it on Twitter, Facebook, and of course to target advertising and content thereafter, particularly political advertising, is deeply, deeply sensitive. Certainly, I'll just come back to that. Certainly in the UK, when we've kind of run surveys in this area about people's attitudes to the use of emotion profiling systems, we expected people to be more averse to biometrics. We expected a knee-jerk reaction, say, oh, that's the body, I don't like that. But no, one of the questions that we asked was about the use of emotion profiling for political reasons. People hate the idea. So I think although this talk has been mostly about biometrics, Yeah, it's sentiment analysis and online and tracking of online sentiment is of real concern to certainly to kind of citizens in the UK. But in terms of policy, we've talked a lot about the harms and some of the negatives, and mentioned a couple of the positives. But we've been really kind of thinking about some of the ethical harms, particularly kind of around kind of freedom of thought and about privacy. In the last couple of years, things have really changed in this area. So whereas the General Data Protection Regulation on the GDPR in 2018, that doesn't mention emotion at all. E-privacy, which is the sister piece of legislation to the GDPR, that has one mention of emotion in the recitals. Now, emotion profiling is being recognized at the highest levels in terms of the UN in relation to kind of the rights of privacy in the digital age. Basically, it's an update, it's a digital version of human rights that was adopted last year. UNCRC, again, United Nations, General Comment 25. In essence, this is targeted at children. And again, this explicitly mentions and discusses emotion profiling in relation to children as a core harm. In Europe, the proposed AI Act, which was announced last year, this puts emotion recognition systems, you'll see highlighted in yellow there, in Article 1. So whereas GDPR 2018, emotion recognition was nowhere to be seen. Emotion recognition systems now are in kind of Article 1 of the proposed AI Act, which is the piece of legislation that, by definition, is looking to guide and regulate AI in Europe. I'm a little short on time, but in terms of kind of how emotion profiling is going to be scored, this is in relation to kind of the risk levels from the European AI Act. And mostly, it's going to be seen as limited risk, except in kind of key areas such as workplaces. So if you think back to the higher view video and the higher view slide, it's in relation to kind of recruitment and employment, in relation to education and children, and also use of public services and safety components of vehicles as well, so also in cars. So although emotion recognition within the AI Act is deemed limited risk, realistically, many of the use cases are going to be high risk. My guess, I guess an educated guess, is that emotion recognition, emotion profiling, by the time the proposed act becomes a proper piece of legislation, it will all end up being high risk. That would be kind of my judgment on that. So yes, I'm slightly mindful of time, but just to kind of give you a quick sense of what I was referring to earlier. So if you look on the left-hand side of the slide, you'll see the percentage of people who are not okay. I don't have time to go through the direct questions that we ask kind of UK citizens, but basically it was kind of to what extent are they okay with given uses of emotion recognition systems, such as in social media, such as in workplaces, such as in school classrooms. And it's interesting to see that, again, that kind of social media for political advertising purposes scored even higher than workplaces in terms of levels of concern about the use of technologies in this way. So the idea of having email, social media, facial expressions, gesture and behavior in workplaces, that, for me, that sounds quite alarming. But social media was deemed worse. So I think given, the use of kind of social media and sentiment to track and, potentially swing elections, certainly kind of something of concern to people in the UK, more so than biometrics. But I think it's kind of fair to say that none are exactly popular either. And just to finish off, just to take one of the questions there about workplaces, which on the past side was kind of the second key point of concern for UK citizens. It's really interesting to see the age trend there. So in terms of looking from kind of 18 to 24s on the left, you see 45% of people are not okay. And that kind of gradually goes up from the 25s and up to kind of older people. So generally, kind of broadly, there's kind of an upward trend of people not being okay. Particularly interesting with people are 55 to 64. course, certainly in the UK, people will retire around kind of the age of 65. So that'll be people going to the end of their working life, which possibly explains the kind of slight dip afterwards. So you might say then that kind of younger people are kind of more okay with it. Because the numbers of not okays are lower. But just jump to that kind of bottom row of numbers with people who are okay. So basically those people who are okay, they're okay to be identified. So where no okay, no PI means no personal information is shared. The bottom row is where kind of people will be okay to share with personal information. Very few like that. So we have to be a little bit careful with kind of how we interpret the numbers in terms of whether a person is okay, just not okay with the premise outright, okay, but only if it doesn't explicitly identify me, and then okay if it does identify me. And certainly that idea that people would be identified at work, people are much less keen on. So I'll stop there, but thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor McStay. I hope you heard the applause.
I did, thank you.
Thank you for your time and your effort. It was great. Thank you very much. Okay.